Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink. For today's card, it seemed rather fitting to pull out Honeybee's Spring Chicks stamp set. This came out quite some time ago, like last year or something like that. So I pulled it out and I have some Strathmore ready cut watercolor paper and I put it in my MISTI with the smooth side facing up. And then I'm lining up all the images I want to use. And I am going to ink these up with VersaFine Clair Fallen Leaves ink. So it's just a dark brown ink. Usually I stamp with black, but every once in a while I, shake things up and stamp them in different colors. And there's something about stamping images in a dark brown. It's such a subtle difference, but I don't know. It just gives it a different look. So anyway, stamped all the images. I had to stamp one of the chicks a second time because I wanted 5 of them. I just thought it made sense to put 5 of them. I have 5 kids and just all of this. This is kind of the definition of our life right now. So after I was done stamping them, I did really, really simple watercoloring using my Karin Brushmarker Pros. I am still going to call them Karin. Apparently they're pronounced Karin. I don't know how I feel about that. To me, it's just Karin. Anyway, it doesn't really matter what you use for something like this. Like you could use Zig Clean Color Real Brush Markers. You could use Distress Inks, like anything really. I'm not doing anything groundbreaking. I just wanted to add very simple coloring. So I started with Rosewood, which just as random FYI, this specific color. This is why you need to do like swatches and things like that. This is a color that when it's wet or when it first goes down, it has a very green tint to it. And honestly, if I didn't have a swatch right beside me when I was doing this, I would have set it aside and probably restamped everything because I was like, oh, I don't want my chickens to be green. But it's one of those colors that as it dries, that kind of green undertone is not as noticeable. It's, just one of those colors. So having swatches, which is something I'm slowly working on, really helps with your inks and your coloring mediums and all that kind of stuff. So I went along, colored everything in with the Brushmarker Pros, just using a water brush to kind of pull out the color. And since I didn't do any heat embossing, because that's usually what I do, I stamp the image and then heat emboss it and then color to keep things simple. But I didn't do any heat embossing with these, so I was kind of jumping around where I was coloring, or I edited all that out, but I would just use my heat tool to dry an area before I go on and color it. So once everything's colored in, I'm going to use the coordinating wafer dies to cut out all of these images. So I'm going to tape all these wafer dies into place with some washi tape. And then once those are all positioned, I will die cut everything in my die cut machine. And I'll have to run it through a second time to die cut the extra little images that I had stamped and colored. So after I had done that, I pulled out some wood grain cardstock. And I used the Honeybee Chicken Coop wafer dies that came out at the same time as the stamps, obviously. So I'm going to die cut the base of the coop with that wood grain paper, which you'll see more in the photos at the end on camera. It just doesn't really look like anything. But after I die cut it, I pulled out Barn Door Distress Oxide ink. And I'm going to blend this all over this cardstock. Doesn't need to be a perfect blend. Mostly because I just wanted, the color there. I'm going to do a whole bunch of splattering because I'm kind of obsessed with that yet again. I kind of come and go. Like, it's funny. I'll splatter everything constantly for weeks. And then it fades away. I stop doing it. And then I get comments from people like, where's all the splatter? So, anywho, I added the barn door to the chicken coop. And then I'd added a bit of Spiced Marmalade Distress Oxide ink to the straw that I die cut from some yellow cardstock. And then I had pulled out the Honeybee DECKLE Edge Squares wafer die, and I used the largest die to die cut just some kind of light aqua cardstock. And then I'm blending on some Peacock Feathers Oxide ink, and I'm not worried about the center where I've got that dark splotch. That's going to get covered up, so I don't care. I just kind of wanted to deepen the cardstock a little bit, and then I'm going to add more splatter because it just works. So I just smush the ink pad lid against ink pad to get a bit of ink, added a tiny bit of water, and I'm just picking it up with a paintbrush and splattering it all over that piece of cardstock. So I just have that nice texture. Plus the peacock feather color of Distress ink is just beautiful. I love it. So since I started doing the splattering, couldn't stop. So I got the barn door out. I'm going to splatter this. Splattering this color on top of something I like sponged heavily, it doesn't necessarily show up as like a darker red splatter, but it does do this, you know, the water effect that Distress ink and Distress oxides are so well known for. So I was still fine with that because it just gave it, you know, that splattery texture look. And of course I'd done the same with the spiced marmalade on the straw. And then I cut just a piece of this wood grain cardstock. I didn't want to use the centerpiece that was already die cut. I wanted something a little larger so I can adhere it behind everything when I'm done. So I just cut a piece of that wood grain cardstock and I blended walnut stain oxide ink all over it. Once I got that blended, I'm going to do, you guessed it, more splatter. So I'm going to use that though, and I'm going to splatter the walnut stain on the background I'm ink blending now, but I'm also going to splatter that onto the actual like red chicken coop, and then the roof of the chicken coop, which I just die cut from some dark brown cardstock. So I'm going to lay that out, and all of this I'm doing, by the way, on my Waffle Flower water medium mat. I always forget half the time to like pull this out when I'm doing ink blending, things like that, and yet it's so perfect because the silicone texture just grips everything. Plus, like I already showed, like it's just easy. I can just wipe it off and go on about my day. So did the same thing, smushed the lid of the ink pad against the ink pad, and then I picked up the color with a wet paintbrush and I splattered it all over the background, the roof, and the chicken coop itself. So all of this I just set aside for a few minutes and let it dry before I actually start handling everything, you know, and making a big old mess. So after, I splattered the straw too with a little bit more of that walnut stain. So after I was done and everything's dry, now it's time to start assembling this entire card. So I'm just using my craft tacky glue to adhere everything. The straw I'm going to pop up with a little bit of adhesive squares. And then the chicken and the rooster, I'm going to kind of squeeze them into the coop here. And once I'm happy with where they are, I'm going to use a little bit of washi tape to hold them in place. And then once I adhere everything, everything will get adhered down. So the washi tape just kind of holds them in place first. And then I'm going to use scissors as well to trim off the little parts of them that are kind of literally hanging over the edges of this chicken coop. This is really like life defining, this card. So I just used my scissors and trimmed like just kind of right under the very edges of the chicken coop. And then that way I can pop the straw on with a bit of foam tape. And then that brown piece that I had sponged all the ink on and splattered, I'm going to just adhere that as like the inside of the coop. So just put a little bit of adhesive around the edges there and then adhere that into place. And then to assemble everything else, I'm going to be adhering the coop directly to that deckle edge square. And then all the little accessories and the chicks and everything, I'm going to adhere with a combination of the craft tacky glue as well as adhesive squares to kind of pop some of them up. So some of them are squeezed into the coop with them. One's jumping on the roof. You know, this is my life. Kids haven't made it onto the roof yet. Let's hope that never happens. But anyway, after I figured out where I wanted to place everything, I got them adhered. And then the little like bows that I had stamped and colored, I just adhered those onto the little characters as well. So then once those are all adhered, my card base needs to be made. Now, the deckle edge square wafer dies, this largest one that I used for the background, is about 5 inches square. So you can get an idea how big this chicken coop wafer die is. Like, it's huge. So for my card base, I took a full sheet of white cardstock and I trimmed it to 5.5 inches. So it's 5.5 by 11. So I'm going to score it at 5.5, and this will be a top folding 5.5 inch square card. So I used my Teflon bone folder and my Scor-BUDDY to put the score line in there. So then I've got my card base. Now I just need to add some sentiments. So I have the Eggcelent sentiments set, also released with the Spring Chick set last year, whenever it was, which has the perfect sentiment there. And it was the sentiment that inspired this whole card. It says, feeling a little cooped up. So I stamped that onto another piece of that brown cardstock. I used my anti-static powder tool, brushed off the excess, stamped the sentiment with clear embossing ink, and then I coated it with white embossing powder. I'm gonna melt that with my heat tool. And then while I still have my MISTI out, I'm gonna put the card base into my MISTI and stamp another sentiment from the Eggcelent sentiment set. Say that 3 times fast. I'm going to line up the sentiment on what'll be the inside of this card in my MISTI here. And then that I'm actually going to ink up with that same Fallen Leaves ink that I used at the very beginning. So line that up, inked up the stamp with that ink. And then because I didn't want the inside of the card to be completely like just the one sentiment, I needed just one more thing. So I grabbed the one little chick and I just kind of lined him up as if he's standing on the sentiment. And I'm actually just going to ink him up with that spiced marmalade Distress Oxide ink. Just stamped him just to give it a little something. So after that was stamped, I'm going to die cut the sentiment because there is a little mini, like I call it a mini because the sentiment set is huge. It's like a 6x8 stamp set. But there's a few little coordinating wafer dies, just like 4 wafer dies that coordinate with this sentiment set. So I lined up the coordinating wafer die with this sentiment, taped it down, ran it through my die cut machine so that it's all nicely, perfectly trimmed out. And then now all I have to do is adhere everything. So I'm going to adhere the entire scene to the card base with more craft tacky glue. And then I'm going to pop up that sentiment with more just foam squares just to kind of pop it up right along the top of the card. And then once that sentiment is adhered, this card is complete. So as always, I will have links below the video in the description box. I'll have a link to my blog post. I will have a supply list with links to all the supplies I used, so you can check all that out below if you guys are interested. Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting. I really appreciate the support, and I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye!